said to me, it's like, well, things are going well. Why do we want to change? Well, because it's not going to be going well in a couple of years' time when when AI takes your jobs. The way that capitalism is going to change.
That behaviour that you encouraged your employees to have, which is to ask better questions, and that is precisely the behaviour that often gets shut down in organisations today.
Because he wants people who are capable of asking the right question.
The CEOs that are in place at the moment are generally not very well equipped in those areas. In fact, quite often they're the opposite.
So actually, one of the things I would, if I was doing differently, was actually I would put in more processes, not less.
All we do is just make everything transparent overnight. Then, I guess it could quite often freak people out.
He rang up on a Monday morning to find out where everybody was, and they were all at the beach. If there's any one group that you need to pick on in order to have a more profitable organization, then it's the employees.
Who really drives the purpose of the organization, it depends on the size and the complexity of the firm in the first place.
It's a completely different world we're operating in when owners can have that much and yet be supporting so few.
Welcome everybody to this episode of Work Punks. Today we have a special guest, Charles Towers Clarke, who is famous for writing the book The Weird CEO, although I hear a rumor that he doesn't want to be associated with that anymore. So we're going to quiz him certainly on that. We'd love to hear more about how you arrived at The Weird CEO and what's happened since, actually. So introduce yourself to our audience.
Okay, well, thanks all. Good to be in the pub again. So I wrote The Weird CEO because 6 years ago or so, I felt that AI was going to become slightly problematic in terms of what we were going to be doing as humans at work. And so I wanted to focus on the human skills that we need to be bringing in into work in order to be able to deal with what AI is going to be bringing along. And though I think that the book is now slightly out of date, Paul was arguing that it's not. So that I did. I wrote the book as a result of, or from the change that I made in my own organization, which was a company called Pod Group, which had offices around the world, which actually created some interesting cultural points of view as well, which we can go back on. But and then Pod Group was sold a couple of years ago, and since then I have been studying for a doctorate to try and understand all the screw ups that I made earlier on.
Trying to make scientific sense of that. Great. So Weird, it's an acronym, isn't it?
Yeah.
What does it stand for?
So I tried to bring in the things which I thought were important for the human skills. It's wisdom, emotional intelligence, initiative, responsibility, and self-development.
Right.
Of which probably the most important of those I felt were the initiative and the responsibility, which has come quite interesting around COVID, obviously, when people are having to work at home and take their own initiative and responsibility.
Mm.
So what were your key takeaways from, let's take the COVID period, and what were your key takeaways from introducing those kind of concepts, and what people find hard or what people perhaps really benefit from and take to quite quickly and naturally?
Well, I think the power of inertia is something which we underestimate. So people's ability to go back to what they know, and even after 2 or 3 years of COVID, I know there's a lot of people who still are working at home, but I'm still shocked when business leaders say, no, we have to go back to the office, especially when they say it en masse, everybody has to go back to the office. I was like, yeah, really, you don't have the imagination to work out who might be better in the office and who might be better not in the office. But anyway, so there's a couple of times through the process when I was changing the organization to try and get people to take initiative, where I was just surprised at the unwillingness to change. Once I'm in this situation, I'm happy. Why on earth would I want to change? And I tried to make the change when things were going well, which is normally the opposite of what people do. And that actually made it even harder because, as somebody said to me, it's like, well, things are going well. Why do we want to change? Well, because it's not going to be going well in a couple of years' time when when AI takes your jobs. So that was that. I think that was probably the thing that I had most underestimated was people's unwillingness to change.
You saw the advent of AI as the most important driver to bring those organizational changes about in your own company. Most organizations, I guess, that, well, certainly that I work with, they look at similar concepts of autonomy and empowerment and encouraging people to make their own decisions, etc. Because of employee engagement, because they hope that they get better outcomes from that process, from the organization, become more efficient, all the good things, being able to deal better with the complexity that most companies are faced with in their marketplaces. You very much linked it to the advent of artificial intelligence. Now, AI, of course, has since skyrocketed in the sense that it's now really in the public domain, isn't it? I mean, everybody and his dog is using ChatGPT or similar quite regularly. So do you feel that, I mean, what's been your observation in that sense? Have you been right to take that angle and to encourage your company to go down that route, or have you had other observations or learnings from that?
I think you have to look at it two ways. One is from the AI point of view, it's an existential threat. I mean, yes, you can say it's an existential threat on the world, et cetera, but I'm talking about an existential threat to companies, because if they don't use it, somebody else will, and they'll get knocked out of the playing field. But taking the conversation slightly further away, because I'm on my third side around, is that AI has also brought up another whole dimension about ownership. Because if you start to look at what AI can do in terms rather than what humans can do, then you're beginning to start to question what is the capital of the company, what's the value of the company. And by looking at employees as people who can work with AI and ask the questions that AI is incapable of asking, basically, you're then starting to look at capitalism in a completely different way. Sorry to go a little bit extreme here, but the way that capitalism is going to change, because you're going to have a lot of people who own the algorithms, and then you're going to have people who are capable of asking questions that AI are not capable of asking, and they will have value. And then you have everybody else. So if you don't change those everybody else, we're going to have a problem.
Because they become obsolete?
And they lose purpose. There's a book from the 1950s, I think it was, called The Player Piano, which depicts exactly this scenario, where you have engineers who keep the algorithms running, and everybody else just works for the army or building roads.
That's quite a dystopian future then, isn't it, Charles?
Ironically, we were talking earlier on about the fact that we shouldn't go too radical, because actually it puts people off.
But to link this back to your initiative with Pod, obviously, if I understood that correctly, it was therefore to encourage your workforce to become not like the people that were being used as robots, but to equip them and encourage them to equip themselves to become the question askers and the drivers of creativity and innovation, rather than the end products of it. Is that right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I was just struck by what you said there, that that behavior that you encouraged your employees to have, which is to ask better questions, and that is precisely the behavior that often gets shut down in organizations today. So that suggests that is a radical shift. Whether you think that's a radical proposal or not, I don't particularly, but it is a radical shift to the way a lot of organizations work at the moment, which is going to create a lot of strain. And I think those that don't make that shift will probably disappear, no matter how big they are right now. But which sort of brings me to my question, which is your manifesto, if you like, for the Weird CEO, sort of,
Manifesto? No.
well, your sort of your thesis,
Sound
if
like
you
I'm a
like, your
communist.
recommendation that these are the important characteristics is, I think, today has quite a wide acceptance that that's that is the way forward. That the reason we got together was because we all believe that we need more human organisations and more of that in organisations. But the CEOs that are in place at the moment are generally not very well equipped in those areas. In fact, quite often they're the opposite, particularly if they favour a more autocratic style, work style. They're very much around process and very task oriented and goal driven and all that sort of stuff. I mean, and those are not the qualities of the future. So again, there's another strain there. How does this change happen? Because when you did it at Pod, you were quite insightful, and I was reading something you wrote about how you basically once you'd done it, you didn't have anything to do because you'd given all your decision making away. Whereas generally today, people at the top think that that's their role, is decision making. So how do we transition, and what do you think that transition might look like?
Well, I think you just said it. It is people at the top think that that's their role, is to make decisions. But I would slightly disagree with you, Colin. I think there are more and more leaders which are coming up who realize that their job is not to make decisions, but to coach other people and to put options to other people. And the other thing where I screwed up when I was doing Pod was the fact that I didn't have enough processes, because people still need some lines in which to operate. And by expecting people to understand what was the right thing to do, they didn't have lines within to operate. So actually, one of the things I would, if I was doing differently, was actually I would put in more processes, not less, when I'm making a change like that. The difference is understanding how those processes come about. Do they come about from top tier management, or do they come about through other ways of understanding what's going to be beneficial for the organization, especially from ideas from below? And I focus very much on trying to get ideas from below, but again, as I say, I probably needed a bit more formality to help that happen. And that's one of the reasons why I'm doing what I'm doing now, is because I realized that in order to have that, you have to have structure. In order to allow people to blossom, you have to put some structure in which they can operate within.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's sort of some of the stuff you touch on, Paul, isn't it? With how to, it's all very well saying self-management is great, but unless you know how to do it, and then if you don't give people tools like the advice process and other decision-making methods, you've taken them from a situation where generally they're tightly constrained to one where there are no guide rails at all, and that's disorienting, isn't it?
Yeah, that's very true. In my experience, that causes anarchy, but most importantly, it also causes so much confusion, especially if you are trying to transform an existing organization into something that operates differently. Then I think that one of the first steps really in that process is to be very clear on what you're trying to achieve as an organization, what good looks like, and then subsequently to build some boundaries within which people can start to figure out new ways of working and new processes.
I also wonder what role principles have in that context. Rules are nearly always wrong because they never are able to fit the massive variety of contexts that the complexity of organizations and the people within them can throw up, but principles can serve people in those organizations really well in terms of that guide rail, to pinch one of Colin's expressions, as a guide rail to enable them to do the right thing, but in alignment with kind of the general intended direction of travel. I also wonder whether kind of conditioning features a little. you know, when we do go in, you know, quite radically and make big steps in kind of levels of autonomy or transparency or whatever, for those of us that have been in and around work for a few decades, that can very often feel a bit like a management trap. Is that, hang on a minute, you're gonna, you know, be open about the P&L. You'll want us to be open about our salaries. You want this. This is a management trick, you know. And there's that kind of resistance and suspicion, I guess, because we've all carry a few scar tissues of falling into management traps over the years, whereas that, you know, that was never the intent. It's just that, you know, we have a principle to, you know, be more open and be more sharing, and equipped with that information, people are more likely to be able to step up and show initiative and take responsibility. But if all we do is just make everything transparent overnight, then, you know, I guess it could quite often freak people out because they've been conditioned that isn't how it is.
That was your experience as well, Charles, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I remember when we said that we're going to put our salaries transparent and we're going to let people choose their salaries. Somebody came up to me and said, so I'm sure that there's something here where you're going to be taking money away from our salaries. I said, well, can you explain to me exactly how I'm going to take money away from you when you're the one who's choosing what salary you're going to have? Because I'm not seeing it. So they were persuaded eventually. But Colin, going back to your question on leaders, I'm not convinced that leaders are the problem. Actually, I think most leaders, by virtue of the fact they get to be leaders, yes, they've got short-term pressures, especially when they're listed companies, etc. So maybe there's some structural stuff we need to do there as a problem. But for me, the bigger problem is middle management. You've got these people who have got to themselves in a situation where they have a certain amount of power and purpose coming from that power. And then you especially when it's men, and then you suddenly say, well, actually, we're not really sure that we want you to be doing that role of where you are sitting in the middle, passing information and authority up and down, and we want you to be coaching and helping people to do stuff. That's a hard change for people to make.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I guess there's, you know, middle management covers a very wide spectrum of roles and responsibilities and people and age groups and whatever. So I think there's definitely evidence that, you know, that sort of layer. I mean, I'm still not letting leaders off the hook. I'm sorry, they still do carry, because the whole structure is that, you know, they are the leader and the decision maker and, you know, source of power and stuff. But the people in the layers just below them can definitely, you know, find it very difficult to consider that they might actually have to change what they're doing and fear that, you know, the end result is that they're going to be pushed out the door. I mean, the reality is they're probably going to get pushed out the door anyway. So they just haven't realised that.
Depends. I mean, there are a bunch of companies who have successfully moved people from being managers to coaches.
I mean, I think, but further down, you know, people who are probably less entrenched, a bit younger, are probably more open to that change.
Of course, a lot of what we describe, I think, is especially true in you know, well-established organizations that have a long-standing culture where the DNA goes back yonks, and of course, that as a result, they're very hard to change. And even if there is an initiative for change, it's usually not middle management that initiate that, and therefore they are the recipients of, oh, we're going to do things differently here, guys and girls. Now please change, and that's it's rather tough.
Yeah, especially, I mean, this is where I do agree with you, Colin. I think a leader's job is to make sure that the structure is right. And if they come along and say, we want to change the culture and please change, but I'm not actually going to change the structure or change the processes or change anything else, then yeah, nothing's going to change, obviously.
I think we tried to unpick this one in one of our previous podcasts as well, or our previous recordings, where I think the conclusion, well, my conclusion at least, was that we felt sorry for the middle management. It's not easy to be in that middle layer, but we also appreciate exactly what you are illustrating, Charles, that sometimes, as a result of the position that they're in, they may come across as the blockers of change. You said something along the lines of that the advent of AI requires different skills from people, but also probably different jobs, right? Mm-hmm. Certain jobs will disappear.
Certain tasks will disappear.
Yeah. So what my daughter is 16, so she's beginning to make quite important choices in terms of her A-level subjects and what she may want to go and study at uni. What are the kind of jobs that she should avoid?
So it's interesting. You think she's making important decisions now, and you don't think she's going to, go out of university and then meet somebody who's going to go, this, I need somebody to help me doing this, and then that will be her career path.
That's not how people choose careers at this stage, is it?
I'm being flippant, but my point is that actually, it's more about, for me, it's more about learning the skills you need to have rather than the content you're learning. So my daughter's gone off and done humanities. She's doing anthropology. It's like, for what use is anthropology, learning about a whole bunch of societies which are dead? Which is the question that she asks actually quite regularly. And I'm keep trying to persuade her that no, it's not about that. It's about the cultural knowledge you'll get and the skills you get from understanding how to read and understand, look at the studying you're doing and the way that it's been put together. So for me, I don't know, maybe I'm odd, but I think it's fairly irrelevant what you study.
It's interesting. I did economics with social anthropology and a bit of psychology, and the social anthropology has been incredibly useful in looking at the world of work and understanding how change happens and belief systems and how culture works. And the psychology is really useful. And most of the economics has not really been that helpful. I mean, it's been helpful in the way of learning how to think. It's taught me how to analyze and ask those good questions and do all that sort of stuff. But actually, most of the economics, what is taught as economics these days, is absolute nonsense. So, you might think that's the most practically useful one, and it's not.
But I think Colin's point is absolutely dead on. I mean, I mentioned earlier on this CEO who probably do an article on thoughts, and he mentioned that he wants people who are anthropologists and philosophers, because he wants people who are capable of asking the right question. And he specifically said, I don't want developers for the future. And yet all the schools and the government and everybody else is telling us that we need to have more developers.
It reminds me of the Charles Cray when he developed the first supercomputer, the Cray 1, and when he went on to develop the second one, so for the Cray 1 he got all the best computer scientists he could find. For the second one he hired biologists, philosophers, people from all sorts of places, because he said we need ideas that are outside the scope of what computer science knows at the moment. So it doesn't matter how much you know about computer science, you won't have the right answers for where we need to go with this technology. And I think that's where we are. We're on the cusp of that at the moment, aren't we? I mean,
yeah, I think if I was your daughter, I would be saying, and not quite yet, but when she goes into the market, into the world, the job market, is to be asking the companies exactly what Colin has said. What do you think you need and why? And if they're going, well, we want more technicians, like, oh, okay, you're not going to be around long. Off, adios.
At some point, Charles, you said if I do it again, I do it differently.
Making the change, I mean, we only had 50 people, though, as I mentioned earlier on, we had it across Hong Kong, Mexico, San Francisco, Spain, UK, so Nicaragua. So it was very different cultures, which made it quite interesting. One of the things, just a small anecdote, one of the things we suggested was that people could go and work where they wanted and when they wanted. Again, this was before COVID. My Mexican partner said he tried it, and unfortunately he rang up on a Monday morning to find out where everybody was, and they were all at the beach. And he said, "What are you doing at the beach?" He said, "Well, you said we could work when and where we wanted." It's like, yes, but you're meant to cover, make sure there's somebody in the office, somebody who's going to cover the phones. So there is different cultural aspects to it. The other problem is how fast you're moving. So we had people who were, I'm not going to put cultural stereotypes on it. So we had people who were quite keen on not moving at all, to other people who really embracing this, wanted to go forward as fast as you can. And the problem there was trying to make sure that you brought us both along at the same speed. Because I had no idea what I was doing, I didn't have a plan in place. I didn't come and hire you first, Paul, before I started, which is what I should have done. So I didn't have a plan in place. So I didn't know really what I should be doing when. And I couldn't, worst of all, I couldn't really tell people what would be happening when. So I was just doing it on the cuff to see, and therefore trying to keep those who wanted to go faster happy, while at the same time not to go too fast with those who weren't. So that would be one thing, is have a bit more of a plan. There's obviously much more people who have done it now, so it's easier to see what the direction of it's going to be. One of the things that I didn't do and should have done was to be more systematic about processes, not putting processes in from the top, but taking more time to understand both the formal and informal processes that people were doing, who was talking to who, why they were talking to, what was happening there, and making that, and A, documenting them, and B, making that part of the process, part of the organizational structure and process, so that those could then be changed or kept, rather than just being left in the mind of one or two people. And if it had more of a stable base, I think it would have been easier for people to see how to grow upon it, rather than resisting the change, because they felt that everything was being, the large carpet was being pulled up from underneath their feet.
So what I'm curious about is, but this may be hard for you to answer, because obviously you've since sold the company and moved on to new exciting challenges. Is how sticky a change like this is. Has it endured? Do you know?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, that. So from some side, it's what's interesting is that none of the people who were, say none, very, very few of the people who were there, and in fact, I don't actually know of any, who were there at the time that I was there, have subsequently left the company. And I think that's because of the culture that we got, that they enjoyed it. But the company which has bought it is a very bureaucratic organization. So whether that will stay, I don't know. So has that changed? I don't know whether it's changed, but I think a lot of the characteristics that we built through the change are still there, which is part of the reason why it was bought in the first place. But when you start adding huge amounts of bureaucracy and very frustrating decision-making processes, then obviously the motivation is lost. And so people default back to the normal hierarchical status quo, which we've had for thousands of years.
Tell us a little bit more about your PhD. What led you to focus on what it is that you're studying and researching?
Well, I mean, I just indicated on it. It was the informal and formal side, to try and understand whether there's better ways of taking some of the informal. I mean, if you think about it, you've got hierarchies. That's how theoretically things get done. In reality, shit gets done by two people talking together. And it's when those two people talk together that is the interesting part for me is see how people are networking with each other and how the processes actually work across these more informal networks. But as a result of that, I've been starting to look at what is the purpose of a company. It goes back to the point I was bringing up earlier on. Is what is the purpose of a company, or more accurately, for whom is the purpose of a company? Because the four of us, I suspect, look a lot about employees or colleagues or whatever you want to call them, and that's probably our main focus. But when you start to look at the managers and investors, and then the other way, suppliers, community, customers, you start to try and especially with the environmental situation we're in, you start to try and look at, well, who is a company for? Is it for the shareholders, which obviously Friedman's view, but is it for the employees? Who's it for? So for me, that's an interesting question, because without that, it's difficult to really understand what's the purpose of your company. What's your company there to do?
And are you veering towards any particular conclusion?
Well, I mean, I think there's obviously there's a mountain of research out there which says that employees, by concentrating on employees, you're going to thereby improve performance with customers. You're going to improve the performance of the community, which in turn will lead to greater profits, and therefore your investors will be happy. So if there's any one group that you need to pick on in order to have a more profitable organization, then it's the employees. But there are some contradictions to that, because employees are there. Yes, most employees are intrinsically motivated. That's great. But there is an extrinsic motivation that I want to make more money. And that's more short term, and can be at the detriment of the long-term profit of the organization. So no, the short answer is I don't know what the purpose of an organization is, but it sure as hell isn't just to make money, as we all have concluded. But there is this, what I'm fearing is that there's this sort of zero-sum game where you're saying, well, it's either got to be for this or it's got to be for that. And I think what would be interesting is enlightened leaders who can say, actually, it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, but we do need to work out what is the purpose, and more importantly, for whom.
Doesn't that depend, I mean, on the size of organization? Because, there's a very strong case that for, listed organizations, particularly organizations in the, FTSE 100, Fortune 500 scale, that the organization is run for the benefits largely of the CEO and the C-suite, and because they take, if they are successful at pushing up the share price, they get disproportionate rewards, and they can really pretty much do what they like. The way governance works these days, there is no real shareholder voice. There is the voice of the investing establishment, which tends to be fairly quiet. So, the whole concept, the context that they operate in actually means that the organisations are run for the benefit of the people that are running them these days.
That's quite cynical.
Is it?
Yeah, I mean, it's I can't completely disagree with you, Colin, but it's kind of easy to lambast a few people at the top and say it's all their fault, whereas actually I would argue that it's as much society's fault as it's their own, by the fact that we all want instant demands and more money and quick dividends.
Yeah. No, I think the way they behave is rational in the context that they're in, but yeah, that sort of brings back to my previous point, which is that these are not the qualities of weird CEOs that have gotten to the top. So I mean, in some ways, that they're almost a group apart because the people that are really going to change are the smaller companies that are not so constrained by need to deliver quarterly results to shareholders and that whole investment cycle.
Yeah, there's no question that being an unlisted company gives you a lot more ability to look long term. That's for sure.
There's 2 points involved in this, one of which is the original concept of the firm was that it served its shareholders, and the concept of shareholders isn't really valid anymore in the modern multinational corporation. Unless you happen to be something like News Corporation, where Murdoch owns a great big chunk of it, then he's a shareholder voice, but otherwise they're not really that apparent. And this all came about following Friedman's saying it's about shareholders. The way that compensation was changed was intended to tie the behaviours of the people running the companies to the interests of the shareholders, but it's actually perversely, arguably done the opposite.
So maybe, Charles, just an idea shooting from the hip, but maybe your concepts around who really drives the purpose of the organization depends on the size and the complexity of the firm in the first place.
Well, there is, there is some writings out there about exactly that actually a community and the environment has a far greater influence on a smaller company because they have to ride on the back of their reputation within the local community. Whereas a bigger company can frankly pay off lobbyists to screw the other stakeholders. That's the view. So it very much depends on which organization it is and when. But even so, I still think that it's a subject which is going to get more pertinent because we have to, especially going back to the beginning with AI, we have to understand what are we building things for? Are we building algorithms for a very small minority of shareholders who own those algorithms? Because that's the point now, is that it's possible to own a lot with very few people working for you. I mean, I think WhatsApp was, I may be wrong on this, but WhatsApp originally had 11 people or something for until they were sold, more or less. I mean, it was
the billions.
Yeah. So it's a completely different world we're operating in when owners can have that much and yet be supporting so few.
Yeah, so that will be an interesting future development to observe and hopefully also to be part of. So we are certainly looking forward to your findings, Charles, from your PhD to help us.
Right. Okay.
And navigate.
Well, you might be waiting a while on that one.
And in the meantime, I'll hope that my daughter and her generation will make the right
Save
choices
us.
so that we people will be safeguarded. Our time is pretty much up, Charles. I really want to thank you for your participation and thought-provoking contribution to our recordings and to our Work Punks session. So thanks for that. It's been
thank you.
Interesting. And sometimes you made my brain hurt. So to have a lie down after.
What do you think mine does every day?
Sorry?
What do you think mine does every day?
Oh, well, thank you. That makes me feel slightly better. So listeners and viewers, we hope that you enjoyed this session. Do tune in for the next one. So I hope to see you soon. Bye for now. Bye.
Bye for now.
Bye.